Hello, I'm Jim Cornwall, and this is the WalkingPost.com podcast. WalkingPost.com is the news website dedicated to walking, with all the latest on gear, books, fitness, events, trails, festivals, health, and more. This podcast is number 43, and we're already into March. Someone please tell the weather. This podcast is going live on March the 6th. It was strange that I mentioned the Galloway International Dark Sky Park last week because it made the news this week. So maybe if I say something, it happens. So I should mention how I won the lottery next week. Shortly after we moved here, we paid a visit to the observatory in the park. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere, as you'd expect, because it needs to be dark. It was horrible weather, so we didn't really see a lot through their telescopes, so we decided we would go back another night, and then it burned down. Well, this week an announcement was made that it is being rebuilt, although not in exactly the same location, so that's good news. Anyway, let's get to March the 6th. It is Dress in Blue Day, and I admit it, I'm not. It's Oreo Cookie Day, and it's Frozen Food Day. It's also Dentist's Day, and I wonder if there's any connection between Dentist Day and Oreo Cookie Day. Ironically, with all that's happening in the world right now, today is the day in 1912 when airships were used in war for the first time, when Italian troops dropped bombs on Turkish soldiers from 5,000 feet in the air. Birthday-wise, it's the special day of Cyrano de Bergerac, and it is the birthday of Pink Floyd's David Gilmour. Amazingly, he is 80 today. Last time we chatted with Tiffany Jones, who wrote a book called Couch to Kilimanjaro, about her experience walking up a mountain. This week we're going a little higher because it's the best-selling author Graham Hoyland to talk about his walking book and his upcoming book on Mount Everest. Before we get going, if you do have news, guest ideas, or even subjects to cover or comments, or if you want to advertise, please do get in touch via walkingpost.com, or you can just email me directly at jim@walkingpost.com. So let's go through some of the headlines of the news articles you may have missed that we had on walkingpost.com this past week. Fitville has launched the Cloud Strider V3 shoe. We had an article on a company that sells hiking holidays for single people who can then make friends with the others on the trip, should they choose to. And Walking for All has announced an event to inspire health, inclusion and community in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. A popular wildflower trail has reopened in California. The Heart of Kent Walking Festival is coming up in a few weeks. And just to let listeners know, we have updated the hiking festival's calendar for 2026 on the homepage. I don't like to do that too early in the year because of all the ones that would just say to be announced, but there aren't too many of those now. The Canadian government is financially supporting a new trail in Quebec. There's been a funding boost for walking in Derbyshire, and the S&DR 200 Festival announced the opening of the Trail of Discovery. And the S&DR is the Stockton and Darlington Railway, which is celebrating its 200th anniversary, as you may have guessed from the 200 part. Anyway, you can read all of these and more at walkingpost.com. That brings us relatively neatly into this week's guest, and in this conversation we have a boa constrictor, Mount Everest, Acorns, Rutland, and, appropriately, spring. Graham Hoyland is a British author, mountaineer, sailor, and adventure film producer, and he was the 15th person from Britain to reach the summit of Mount Everest in 1993. His latest book, First on Everest, is out in May. One of his previous books is called Walking Through Spring, which I definitely recommend as it's about following spring by walking from the south coast of Britain to the Scottish borders. All right. Hi, Graham. Good to talk to you. Thanks so much for doing this so early in the morning because you're over in California. So, to start, you've definitely done a lot. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about the story so far.
Well, I grew up in Rutland in England, lovely sort of secret Cotswolds country, lovely walking. And every year we used to go up to my mum's island of Arran in the car with my dad driving, usually overnight because they were so poor they couldn't afford to stay overnight. So it was really exciting to drive up through England and Scotland every year. And he used to tell me stories. And one of them was, did you know that the season of spring goes up through England and Scotland at walking speed? And this went into my 5-year-old brain. I thought, that's interesting. I'd like to follow the spring one year. And so many, many years after of doing climbing on Arran and eventually climbing Mount Everest, becoming the 15th Brit to climb Everest, me and my girlfriend Gina decided to walk through England and walk with the spring. And it was the best 3 months that we've had together walking up through England.
You mentioned that you've climbed Everest, so clearly there's a connection to writing about walking. But could you tell me about walking through spring and how you came to do that? You said that the idea was formed when you were 5 years old.
Yes, well, having got this into my mind, I thought I'd like to do that one day. So after clearing out all the baggage of the things I wanted to climb, the big mountains I wanted to climb, I fancied doing a more thoughtful walk. And I've always thought walking is the best of sports because, say, with horse riding, you need a horse. In fact, you need two horses because one's always lame. Or, I don't know, scuba diving, you need all this kit. The best thing about walking is that you just need a couple of boots, a pair of boots, and you're out the door and you're walking. We still walk every day, at least 5 miles, up in the canyons here near Los Angeles. And it's a lifelong habit. And that walk through England, walking through spring, was like an expression of the best walks I can ever remember.
Did you learn a lot about spring and about the different seasons as you walked?
Yes, I learned a hell of a lot about spring. We started at the south coast down near Bournemouth, and I literally walked out of the water. First person I met was a man taking his boa constrictor for a walk. Literally, he had this thing wrapped around him like a scarf. He just said to me, she loves the spring, my boa constrictor. And this thing, meanwhile, was looking at me malevolently. And I said, has it never, sort of tried to squash you or throttle you? You're wearing it around your neck. No, no, no. And off he walks. So that was the first event of spring. But then it got more English. We headed up north through these wonderful little lanes and past these chalk streams. And I had with me a rucksack full of acorns. And I planted an acorn every mile, absolutely, very, very carefully. We made sure every mile I went into the hedgerow or into a wood and buried an acorn. And so the whole route we did, hopefully, will have around about 500 oak trees growing in a line all the way up to Gretna Green.
Do you plan on redoing it to see how many of them have taken?
Well, yes, we do plan to go and look at them. My girlfriend Gina marked every single one on her smartphone. So we have a map with a line of points. But, even if just one oak tree grows, it's worth it to me. These things are wonderful. They live for about 1,000 years because they grow big. And then even when they're fallen in the forest, they provide a habitat. I think there's about 200 species in an oak tree. I just love being with them and under them. It was a real joy to try and add to the number of oak trees we have in our country.
A couple of the themes that come through from the book. One is your love of poetry, because there's a lot of references to other writers in there. But the other one is your clear concern about conservation and about the state of British countryside. Has that changed since you wrote that book?
Well, my love of poetry was helped by walking through England. There are a number of writers I love. I mean, when I was a kid, I loved the writing of B.B. He wrote about the little grey men. No one ever has heard of this or reads it. But this was the story of little gnomes that live in the roots of a tree by a brook. And this absolutely captivated me as a kid. And they sailed down the river And in this book, which was written during the war, 1942, there's a feeling of a lost England very strongly from this author, valedictory feel. And I felt that as I went through England. The fields are so enormous now. All the hedgerows, the precious hedgerows that we've had for thousands of years, are grubbed out. The land is soaked with chemicals. It was almost like saying goodbye to England. I felt sad about it. But other writers who are a bit more positive, Edward Thomas, who's a poet, but also Richard Jefferies, another favourite author, who wrote Bevis, one of our best nature writers. Again, people haven't really heard of him or read him now, but he's really good on the English countryside and the love of walking through it.
Are you pessimistic at this point about the countryside and about the loss of habitat and species, or is there some spark of optimism there?
I am a little sad about the way the English countryside has been abused, particularly in the last 60 years or so. But I do see little bits of hope. As we walked through England, we kept coming across these little nature reserves. And there's people out there like us who love the country, who are putting time and money into, say, a butterfly reserve that we came across. Lots of farmers are putting the hedges back in. I mean, it's crazy because they're using maybe 2 or 3 species where there might have been 100. But there's hedges going back in, there's woods being grown and nature reserves. So I'm optimistic that people's value for the countryside is more now.
How do you think that, I mean, it kind of as an aside, but how do you think that more people can connect to the countryside? Because once you do, I think it's something that makes a big impression and you want to do more. But the number of people that seem to be going out into the countryside doesn't seem to increase.
It's true that the people you encounter generally are older and a middle classer, I suppose. Some people have said recently the countryside is horribly white, but I think that's improving. I think that this is something you grow into. Walking and appreciating the countryside is something that you grow into, and books like my book, Walking Through Spring, can only encourage that. Also, that group have got time and money on their hands, and so I think the hope for the countryside is voluntary groups. I think people who are like the ramblers and the nature lovers, they are the saviour of the countryside, I think.
Again, you've climbed Everest and done a lot of mountain climbing. Do you get the same adrenaline rush or inspiration from the sedateness of walking that you do from mountaineering?
I think walking through England for 3 months and climbing Everest, which oddly enough used to take me about the same time, are both very thoughtful things. What people don't realize that if you climb Everest from the north, which I was for reasons I'll come on to, I was making films and I was hunting for a body. Most of the walking up Everest is walking with your hands in your pockets, walking. That might surprise people. There's one section on the North Col where you have to climb up ropes, and there's a second section near the summit where you have to climb up a ladder. So that's more tricky. But a mountain is technically an easy mountain. So there's plenty of time to walk and think on Everest. And actually, that's what I loved about walking through England. You know, if you do it with your partner, it's just the best coupley thing you can do. You're watching things all the time. You might see a young blackbird hopping on the ground in spring, and you think, you know, is it okay? Should we rescue it? No, because the parents are probably watching. Then you might see little evidence of a fox, or you might see some flower you don't know. And then the wonder of the smartphone, you can look up flowers. Gina, the other day, we were walking through these canyons in California, and she has a bird app, which I'm sure you're familiar with. We were walking along, and all these birds popped up on her phone. And so on both Mount Everest and walking through England, it's really good for your mind. It's a thinking place.
I would imagine that Everest is a little chillier and a little more difficult to breathe once you get past that certain altitude.
Everest is, people don't realize, is actually an altitude problem. You're fighting hypoxia, oxygen starvation the whole time. When you arrive at base camp at 15,000 feet, about the height of Mont Blanc, you feel dreadful. And then it takes a week or so to get ready to climb up to the next camp. You get to that high point, then you go down and sleep low, and then you climb the mountain maybe 6 times, going higher and then coming back down to sleep low and fighting with your body the whole time to acclimatize to the altitude. But otherwise, it's long walks. From base camp, the first walk is 8 miles, I think, at high altitude. Then it's walking up to advanced base camp, then climbing up to the North Col. So it's very much a walking mountain.
Going back to the English hike that you did, what were some of the highlights of the walk beyond the boa constrictor that started it out so interestingly?
Oh, the highlights. So many. Let's start with the end. Just as we approached Gretna Green, we were walking along and this gigantic bird started hopping along and took off from the middle of the field next to us. This was a golden eagle. I never knew that golden eagles would even think about landing in a field, let alone be so close to us. So it's those serendipitous, sudden things that lodge in your mind. There are so many of them. The people you meet also is what sticks in your mind. We literally bumped into all sorts of rural characters. A beekeeper, for example, who we chatted to for quite a long while. He was quite pessimistic because of the effect of pesticides on bees, and that was sad to hear. But they thrive in the city. Farmers who are cleaning the footpaths, clearing them and mowing them to encourage people to walk a bit more. You think farmers sometimes are hostile to walkers, but not necessarily. This guy was clearing the way. And little things like that give you hope in humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I know that you said that you do 5 or 6 miles a day or more. Have you done any other longer treks or walks since the England one?
Oh, yes. I like trekking in the Himalayas. And the reason is that when I was young, 13, I met my famous uncle, Howard Somervell, who was on the first climb of Mount Everest with his friend, George Mallory. And he told me that he'd given his camera to George Mallory. And if I could go and climb Everest and fetch his camera back down, we could prove that his friend George Mallory had climbed the mountain first. So I got this into my head as well and learnt to climb and climbed Everest to become the 15th Briton to climb Everest in 1993. And then we found George Mallory's body in 1999. But after that, I just loved the Himalayas so much that I do these long treks. Last year, we went round to the west of Kanchenjunga and over a high pass with a bunch of friends. And then this year later, we are trekking to the east side of Kanchenjunga in the absolutely beautiful country of Sikkim. And I really urge anyone who's listening who hasn't walked in the Himalayas, give it a go. You can do it very cheaply if you just stay in local houses, and it is really the most beautiful country in the world. In fact, if anybody is interested in coming with us this autumn, we're looking for a couple more people to walk in Sikkim.
What is it about the Himalayas, do you think, that seem to inspire? Is it the fact that Everest is the highest mountain and it's there? Because you don't seem to hear a lot of people that have fallen in love with the Andes or a different mountain range, the Rockies even in North America. The Himalayas seems to be very special.
Yes, the Himalayas are special, and I'll tell you why. You know the Isle of Arran. If you look up at Goat Fell, I remember looking up at that as a kid and working out that is exactly 1/10 of the height of Mount Everest. So if you think of 10 Goat Fells stacked on top of each other, that is the scale of the Himalayas. It is enormous. You look across a valley and you see a village, maybe just a mile away through the air. And you think, well, we may be there Wednesday morning. It's a vast scale. There's beautiful terrain with lush vegetation low down. And then maybe the best thing are the people. You meet these wonderful people. I found mountain people are always hospitable and more friendly than people who live in the plains. The Sherpas and Gurkhas of the Himalayas are lovely, but it's kind of spiritual. When you look up at those wonderful icy white peaks in the morning, and it just looks like a vision of heaven. So that's why people fall in love with the Himalayas. But I would say you can equally fall in love with the Andes or the Alps, or indeed the hills of Arran.
Your latest book is also about the Himalayas. I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about that and the walking in that book.
Yes, my latest book is called First on Everest, and it's all about my cousin, Howard Somerville, who was an amazing guy. He grew up in Kendal and learnt to rock climb just by watching some climbers go up Pavey Arc, up a climb called Jack's Rake. He then moved his climbing to the Alps and was selected to go on the very first climbing expedition on Everest. So in 1922, he was on the first ever attempt to climb Everest with his friend George Mallory. And then they returned in 1924. And sadly, Mallory disappeared up into the clouds with Sandy Irvine, taking with him my cousin Howard's camera, which he had unwisely lent to George. He told me when I met him when I was 13 and Howard was 81, he told me to go and look for his camera, bring it back, and maybe prove that his friend George Mallory had been the first to climb Everest and not Edmund Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing. So off I went. I climbed Everest in 93 and we found Mallory's body in 99. And really, this is all the story, which at first for me was about George Mallory, turned into one about Howard Somerville. He was actually a very much more interesting man. Not only had he done this amazing climb, he'd been a surgeon on the Somme during the Battle of the Somme in the First World War. And then after Everest, saddened by the death of his friend and 7 Sherpas in an accident, he went to the south of India and he found that the poor of India desperately needed medical missionaries. Howard was a devout Christian and he spent the rest of his working life being a surgeon, a medical missionary to the poor of India. And I thought this amazing man deserves his story to be told. And there's so much more about him. For example, he was awarded a gold medal, Olympic medal. That only came out at the last minute when I was researching the book. So Howard was also an enthusiastic walker. After Everest, he, instead of going home like all the other climbers, he decided to take a long walk around Sikkim, around Kanchenjunga, the very area that I'm walking through this autumn. He was just such an amazing man, a polymath whose story deserves to be told.
How did you do all of the research for that? Sounds like it would have been quite, considering the different places that he's been to and lived. It's quite a diverse life.
Yes, there was a massive amount of research. Well, starting in Kendal, and all the climbing magazines were very useful. He used to write articles for the journal of his climbing club. For example, he told a wonderful story of 3 weeks in Scotland. He managed to get 3 weeks of clear, good weather, pretty rare, as you know, in 1921. And it's just this marvellous account of him and his brother trundling along in a 3-wheeler Morgan, 1921, chugging along, staying in small hotels or camping and climbing in the hills. And so that sort of background I could get from journals. Then there was more articles, obviously from the Everest books. Lots of material was in there. And then I had to look in the medical journals for his stories about his life as a medical missionary.
I suspect that it's quite a different undertaking climbing Everest or even any mountain in the 1920s as compared to today with the difference in equipment.
Absolutely. When they were attempting Everest in the 20s, they didn't even know whether it was a rock climb or a snow climb. They knew nothing about it. They knew nothing about the effects of high altitude, of the need to drink all the time. They didn't know how they're going to carry stuff up the mountain. They were pioneers. And I have huge respect for pioneers because no one realizes when they see queues in photographs on Everest, they think it's easy. And Everest has become easy. And the reason it's become easy is because people like Howard Somerville showed them the way.
Absolutely. You're saying how easy it is to walk other than in a few spots and plus the altitude. But is that something that you think that not very many people would know about?
Well, people don't realize a number of things about Mount Everest. First thing is that it is quite easy to walk, but it's also easy to walk across a motorway at night. You can do it. Anybody can walk across a motorway at night, but you might just be taken out. And I was nearly killed 3 times on Everest with avalanche, ice collapse in the ice fall, and falling down a crevasse. A friend of mine was killed in front of my eyes. Another friend was hanging upside down on the Hillary Step for a year, died up there. And on the way up, I saw 5 corpses. It is a very dangerous place. And part of the danger is that it seems so easy. When you see the photographs of queues of people, it looks so easy. But those people have blindly followed a guide on ropes, and they're way above their ability level very often. And when things go wrong, they go wrong fast and they go wrong fatally.
I have interviewed a few mountaineers who have not necessarily climbed Everest, but a recurring theme seems to be a lot of people don't know when it's sensible to stop. Is that something that's an instinct that you know when you should be turning back?
I think the mark of the best mountaineers I've noticed in a lifetime of doing it is knowing when to turn back. There's a classic example in my book, First on Everest. Howard Somerville was near the summit in 1924. He was climbing without oxygen with his friend Norton, and Howard got frostbite in his larynx. It blocked up, and he sat down, choking to die, basically, but managed to do a Heimlich maneuver and coughed it up and was able to breathe again. Now, someone with summit fever might decide to keep on going. They're only 900 feet from the summit. But he and Norton, very wisely, as seasoned mountaineers, knew it was time to stop, to turn around and get back down. And they just got back down in the dark, and they saved their lives. I suspect that George Mallory did keep going, may have got to the summit, but he certainly died on the descent. Where we found his body, it was clear that he had fallen many hundreds of feet. And I think the mark of a good mountaineer, indeed a good walker, is knowing when to turn around. You told me yourself a story about hearing about a flash flood warning in Nevada. You know, some people would keep walking up that canyon and think it didn't apply to them. But the wise walker or the wise climber knows when to give up.
Can you tell me about the trek that you're going to be doing later this year? Is that replicating on purpose what was in the book?
Yes, this autumn I'm going to be repeating the first half of Howard Somerville's walk to Everest. That's in my book, First on Everest. And we're setting off from Darjeeling, which is a wonderful Indian hill town. And then we'll be walking north and down, way down into a gorge of a river, Tista. It's only about 4,000 feet above sea level. And then we will be walking up to the mountain of Kanchenjunga. And it'll be great because we'll be seeing the same scenes that those guys were seeing 100 years ago when they were walking on the way to climb Everest.
You mentioned about the queues going up Everest, and I see online ad after ad for trekking in the Himalayas. What's your thoughts on the sheer number of people that go there now?
A lot of what you see in the media is exaggerated. I have never seen queues on Everest like the ones you see, and this may only happen on summit day on a very narrow footpath or route on Everest. There's loads of places in the Himalayas where you can get away from people. Even on Everest itself, if you go a few hundred meters to one side, you won't see a soul for weeks. When I climbed it in 93, it was post-monsoon, October 93, and there was only one other team on the mountain. So these stories of crowded Everest are much exaggerated by journalists, I think, who I don't know what their motives are. But as for the rest of the Himalayas, you can very easily find long treks where you might only see one other European party in the course of 3 or 4 weeks. So yeah, there's plenty of room in the Himalayas. The Himalayas are, I think, 1,500 miles long, and there are hundreds and hundreds of square miles, I imagine, which haven't even seen a human, unexplored, I'd guess, still.
When does your book come out, the next one?
Yep, First on Everest comes out on May the 12th. I'm having a launch party at the Alpine Club in London, and then the next day we're at Hatchard's bookshop in Piccadilly. And then we're going to be, if there's anybody listening who's up north, I'm going to be in Reged, the Reged Climbing Centre up in the Lake District on the 17th of May. So we're trying to get around the country and tell everybody about Howard Somerville.
Excellent. Are you already starting to think of your next book project?
Yes, I've written 10 books now, and I'm thinking maybe it's time to turn to fiction. I've had a fairly interesting experiences because I'm a sailor as well as a climber. I've given up on the high altitude climbing as it's not very good for your brain. So I decided to take up a sea level occupation of sailing. So maybe fiction, maybe sailing.
Is there anything else that you wanted to mention that we didn't cover, or any other aspects of the book?
Well, I should say that the books being published by the History Press, they've been very helpful sorting out the history and the right sort of pictures. Last year, we ran 3 exhibitions of Howard Somerville's paintings. What many people don't realise that Howard was also probably our best mountain artist. He does these wonderful images. If you look him up, Howard Somerville, just look up some of his mountain pictures. They are absolutely fantastic. So we ran this exhibition to sort of get Howard Somerville into people's minds. And he's for everyone. He's not just for climbers. He's for walkers too. He did more walking than climbing in his life. So that's what I'd like to say. Just look up Howard Somerville and you'll be astonished at what he did in his life.
There must be other unsung heroes of Everest and mountaineering in general that probably have never got either the credit they deserve or the recognition.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Sherpas, would you believe this? No one knows exactly how many Sherpas have climbed Everest, which is shocking, really. You know, these guys do all the work on the mountain. None of us would get up at Everest without the Sherpas carrying loads up to the camps. I think there's a lot of unsung heroes amongst them. And in fact, I have a very good friend who's an Indian climber, and he's just written a book about the Sherpas who surveyed Sikkim, the place I'm walking this autumn. And it's people like him who are getting these names out that really ought to be recognised. You know, the pioneers of our sport.
Funny how last week we talked about Kilimanjaro, this week it's Everest, so next week I have no idea. We can't go any higher, unless someone out there has scaled Olympus Mons on Mars, which I doubt. Anyway, if you do fancy picking up any of Graham's books, including the one that comes out in 2 months, there is a link to Graham's website on the article that accompanies this podcast. So that just about does it for this week. If you do have news or suggestions for podcast guests, please do get in touch through jim@walkingpost.com. And as I keep mentioning, we are always looking for guests, whether it's about a new trail, new equipment, or a new book, or someone who has done an interesting walk somewhere. And it doesn't have to be on a mountain. If you set up a walking group or you're doing a big charity walk, we're more than happy to have a conversation. So, I hope you enjoyed this week's WalkingPost.com podcast, and I hope that you have a great week, hopefully with a walk somewhere, regardless of how short it is. Until next time, happy trails! Walking Post from WalkingPost.com is an Air Coastal Media Limited production.